Welcome to Unleashed, the podcast where we redefine leadership by focusing on what truly matters, the people driving change. Change leadership is about guiding people through transformation in a way that inspires them to embrace change because they believe in it. Whether you're a leader looking to foster a culture of growth or someone eager to break through barriers in life and business, this podcast is for you. Now our host, Wendi.
Welcome to the Unleashed podcast. I'm Wendi, and I'm your host. Today's guest, Eric Dyson, brings a truly one-of-a-kind leadership perspective. He is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, a former nuclear-trained submarine officer, an ERISA expert witness in numerous class action litigations, and now he offers unmatched insight into fiduciary processes and plan governance. With experience at Fidelity and also as an ERISA plan advisor, his mission is to equip plan sponsors and advisors with actionable knowledge to strengthen their fiduciary responsibilities and navigate the complexities of the retirement plan landscape. So, Eric Dyson, welcome to Unleashed.
Wendi, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to chat with you here today.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really good podcast today. There is so much to dig into because you have such a diverse journey. So let's get into it.
All right, let's go.
Okay, let's go. So first of all, many of our listeners are probably saying, what in the world is ERISA? It stands for Employee Retirement Income Security Act. So just let us know what that is.
Sure. Very basically, if you work somewhere where there's a 401k plan, a 403b, or a pension plan, that's the governing documentation. And just very brief history, founded the act was passed in 1974. Before that, you've got some abuse in pension plans where sometimes companies were told, or excuse me, employees were told by the company, hey, I'm sorry, we're out of business. And there's no more retirement plan for you anymore. We wasted all those dollars. So it's protection of those retirement plan assets and the rules that govern how those 401k and pension plans are run.
Okay. And so as a plan advisor and consultant, what is your role in all of that?
So I was an advisor for over 25 years. Now I really do some keynote speaking and talking with committee members and advisors. And I give a very simple example that I think is relatable, and it is football season as we're recording. Maybe somebody
Yes.
somebody might listen to this later, but I paint this picture in a committee, advisors running the retirement plan of playing defense, playing offense, and having special teams. So the defense is you have to get all the legal parts correct. You have to run it within compliance, abide by all the rules, which can be complex, but defense typically doesn't score you any points. Offense now is, do we get the employees interested? Do we get them engaged? Do they understand the benefit? Are they actually saving to get to retirement? And then the special teams is whether there's some additional benefits like a financial wellness tool or counseling or budgeting, things like that. So I break that all down into what have we seen in litigation, what have we learned, and help advisors and committee members just make their plans a little better for their hardworking employees.
Just making the world better, one person at a time. I love that, Eric.
If I can move the needle just a little bit and we all
Yeah.
work on moving it just a little bit, then the needle ends up moving a lot.
Absolutely. Good. Well, share, along those notes, share some of the highlights that first come to mind. If you were to outline your professional journey from, my goodness, being a nuclear submarine officer, I've never met anyone who has been an officer on a nuclear submarine. So I'm sure there are lots of learnings to being an expert witness, to being a branch manager. What a journey. What are some of your insights?
Well, I can tell you this. I will watch war movies with my wife where there's, some bloody battle on a battlefield, and I will turn to her and say, that's why I became a submariner. Okay. I, I initially, I mean, just going all the way back when I was a child, in the late 60s, early 70s, we still had encyclopedias. Okay. So a lot of listeners will have to go look up what that even means. But I would spread out on the living room floor the Army section of the encyclopedia, the Navy. I had them all spread out, and I was fascinated. with them. And somehow, seriously, being on a big ship felt like the safest journey for me. Decided to go to the Naval Academy and became a submariner from there. The company that I was doing my financial plan with recruited me to get out of the Navy and come work for them. So that's how you go from nuclear power to financial services, and that eventually evolves into the 401k world. And then, expert witness just kind of evolved from there.
Mhm. So I'm debating whether to go to the submarine or whether to stay on the leadership journey. So we'll stay on the leadership journey, but just so our listeners know, we are going to get into that submarine, and I want you to unpack that a little bit and what that was like on the submarine. First, though, I know that one of the ways that you define yourself in your bio is as unique. Why this distinction, and why is that important to your leadership journey?
And yeah, I'm very careful when I use the word unique because it means one of a kind. I guess if I could throw someone else in there, I have another colleague and coworker first refers to me as the Swiss Army knife of our business. And so they go together, all right? And most of the things that you do in the qualified retirement space and any financial planning endeavor, you've got to be licensed with what's called the self-regulating organizations, either FINRA or SEC. And I was licensed for a long time, but I am no longer licensed. And that gives me freedom to write thought leadership and give keynote speaking events without having to be overly cautious about what I say. And what I mean by overly cautious, I always kind of throw this sarcasm in there. Thank you, Bernie Madoff, from time to time. And what I mean by that, those regulating organizations, they want those people that are licensed and doing financial planning to be very careful in their messaging to not mislead people, right? But sometimes my thank you, Bernie Madoff means there's overreaching that, well, 99% would understand this, 1% won't. So we can't do it because of the 1%. I am free to say what I want in those things. So I've been down the road of advisors who are helping 401k and pension plans. I worked at a record keeper. I worked at Fidelity Investments. The number of pieces of this industry I've touched make me a little bit unique. And then one day I realized how much gray hair I have and how much time I've spent in this business. And that's not to brag. I really had to I had to realize and embrace that one day that I've got something to teach and train others. So that's where the unique aspect comes from.
So you choose to not be licensed.
Correct. It is a conscious decision.
Wow. And why did you choose that path? Is it just simply the freedom that you've talked about, or is there more to it than that?
Um, it's it is freedom. I don't want to make it sound like I'm trapped if I'm not licensed, but just as an easy example, you mentioned I do expert witness work in litigation, and that involves typically writing an expert report, going through a deposition by opposing a counsel, and potentially testifying in court. Not too many organizations who have compliance over licensed representatives would want somebody doing that. Okay, the caution, their concern is that I or the expert witness might say something on the fly that's very of the moment that isn't quite in line with, what their compliance needs are. So
Okay.
so every now and then I think, hey, I could do this if I was licensed, but then I look at everything I'd have to give up, and staying not licensed in our business is the right answer for me.
Mm, okay. Makes sense. So as you look at your career and you look at all the experiences that you've had as a leader, as being led, as being a part of a team, as being an advisor, a witness, all of these different experiences, when you look at all of that together, what's your superpower?
Um, I'm going to reflect back on, I did listen to a podcast you had a couple weeks ago on servant leadership,
Mm.
and my faith is my superpower. I don't know how well that will resonate. I don't want to preach a sermon here,
Oh, you
but
can
we could
preach.
if
Preach it, Eric. Go.
I mean, it really is, because my leadership philosophy would maybe be the secular answer, but I still have to bring that up to the number one item on my leadership philosophy is define your purpose. right? So my purpose, and I tell everybody about my expert witness work as an example, Wendy, is if that's all I did for work, I would make a lot more money than I do because it pays really well. And I would quit. I would find something else to do. Um, and the reason I do the expert witness work is to share that information with others. What are the lessons learned to make our industry and our business a little better? So I really do think that this leadership philosophy, because there is a faith element in it. Part of my leadership philosophy is what is timeless, what is universal. And I think that it's a lot about what you believe about people. And since you gave me the green light to preach a sermon, I do it a little more gently sometimes in my keynote speaking, right? But I go back to a verse in Ecclesiastes where King Solomon says, I've not found a single good man in 1,000. No, I have searched and I have failed to find what I'm looking for, not one good man in 1,000. Well, from a leadership perspective, that struck me very hard, very difficult. Is King Solomon saying that, 999 people are not good? And I want to look for the good in people and find the good in people, but from a leadership perspective and defining my philosophy, King Solomon is saying when you're looking for the right person, not necessarily just good people,
Mm-hmm.
but when you're looking for the right person and a leader, it may take you 1,000 people to go through to find the right one. So there are plenty of leadership concepts in the Bible that apply, but to me, it's what you believe about how people are motivated and they want
Mm.
a purpose and they want to be appreciated.
So I have about four different places that I want to go here, and I'm just going to go straight into leadership. And I find it fascinating how leadership just continues to evolve. So you go back to the Bible, and leadership has always been there, and yet how we look at leadership today, I think, is different than how we looked at leadership even 10 years ago. I think about when I graduated from college. I'm not going to say the year. It was a minute ago, and I had a degree in management, and I was never even given the opportunity to take a leadership course. We were talking about management. We weren't talking about leadership. And today it's rare that you talk about managing, and everybody wants to be a leader. And so, when I do leadership workshops, one of the first things that I do is I say, well, so write down the name of someone that you consider to be a great leader. And Eric, exactly what you just said about the verse in Ecclesiastes. Do you know how many people? I'll have 100 people in my room. And I don't know, sometimes 50% of those people are just looking at me with a blank stare like, what are you talking about? And how sad is that they can't even write down one name of someone that they consider to be a great leader? So if you were to write down that name, Eric, what name would you write down? And what are some of those characteristics that you see in a great leader?
I could give you way more than one, and because I sought out those people. And let me start this out. And if the listener's not watching, there's a little bit of tear in there. I was hunting with some old shipmates, and so the name is Larry Davis. He was the second captain I had on USS Groton. One of a list of many I could give you for great leaders that I remember. And the reason I tell this story is, we're hunting and we're telling some sea stories, and the two other guys I was with, they referred to the captains that they had on the ship on USS Groton, and they didn't even mention Larry's name, Larry Davis' name. They called him the best one ever.
Whoa.
And so my nature was, I wanted to make sure that I texted Larry Davis and I said, hey, I want to let you know that these guys are referring to you as the best one ever. Because he knew the mission. He let me do my job, right? I had permission to push back on him. And I laughed at a lot of times that there was pushback from me. He was more senior. He was smarter. He was right most of the time. And I was wrong most of the time. But I heard, and there were times when I was right and I would push him a little bit, right? But I mean, I could go on and on and on. And Bob McCall, when I started in financial planning, I still, if I talk to Bob McCall, he was manager, my first job in financial planning. And I've told Bob this time and time again, other than my parents, Bob McCall as an adult did more for me in my life than any other human being has done. That's probably not true now that I found the right wife in life and she's done more for me than any adult. But Bob McCall was on the list. Yeah, when I'm kind of surprised, but then I shouldn't be surprised. You're saying this room just looks at you and they don't know what that means to say who a great leader was.
Mhm.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and as we start to dig into it more and more, they oftentimes start to go, "Oh yeah, I guess I didn't really think about that as leadership," or "I didn't really think about that as leadership." And so, as the workshop evolves, oftentimes they can find a name. And so it's interesting, even as we talk about leadership characteristics, you talk about Larry, and immediately it evokes this emotion in you, and there's just no hesitation. And so how has Larry affected how you lead in the different realms that you've been given the opportunity to lead?
I think we can go back to that, verse in Ecclesiastes 1 in 1,000. Now, when you find that one, you want to empower that person. You want to give them the ability to do their job. And it wasn't, I mean, it starts with him, but I've heard my old shipmates, sailors, officers saying that crew we had when Larry Davis was captain of Groton, many of them said over and over, it's the best wardroom I served with. It was the best crew I served with. And
Mm,
there was an issue of culture, right? For
mm,
how he made us, he empowered us to do our jobs. So he didn't have to micromanage, right? He knew that there would be some mistakes every now and then. And the few times that I let him down by making a mistake that was visible, to the squadron of the world, felt horrible. I mean, I felt horrible. I wanted to make that man look good, not just make me look good, but I wanted to make the ship look good and I wanted to make him look good. And
mm,
that so in answer to your question, I wanted to inspire people as a leader to the degree, hopefully not wasn't an ego, but hopefully they wanted me to look good. But that was to encourage them and to build them up. And I thought if I could do that, then I was on the right track. I didn't care whether they on the ship, didn't care whether they liked me or not. I just cared that they respected me and they were on board with the mission.
hmm. So as you look at your career, and I can't even imagine how many people who have led you, and then you have led other people. I think about leadership, and I wonder, is there such a thing as good leaders and bad leaders?
Oh, absolutely. 100%. I mean, that's a yes, no question. And badly, where do we want to go with this one?
Yeah. Well, going back to the workshop that I do, the reason that I ask that question is, oftentimes we have this pie in the sky, oh, leadership, and what we fail to see is that there are people who lead in the wrong direction. And when we look at leadership, I don't know, I would love to hear your definition of leadership. Mine is inspiration that results in followership and intrinsic followership. Like I follow because I am inspired to follow. And that leader causes me to do something different. It causes action. And so I ask the question, when we look at that definition, was Hitler a leader?
Funny you ask because I've used that example before to the horror of some people,
Yeah.
right?
It's amazing to see
Um,
people's faces. They're like, what are you talking about?
yeah, in shock and horror, and actually just watched a documentary on TV the other night. But the difference there, and here's the difference, right? And I've already mentioned once, number one on my leadership philosophy is determine your purpose, define your purpose, right? Adolf Hitler had a horrible purpose,
Mm,
horrible purpose, and there's the difference. Now you're right, he led people down the wrong path, but he did it also in the wrong method. People lived in fear, right? It wasn't.
mm,
Were there people that wanted to make him look good? Yeah, there were.
sure.
Right, they were aspiring to just gain power, but yeah, they're headed down the wrong path. Or again, this notion, like I said, your podcast a couple weeks ago on servant leadership. Servant leadership is a viable concept, but it's an overused term. And here's what I mean by that: a lot of people don't understand that servant leadership is not an excuse to not get results, right?
Mm,
You are still a leader. All right. And what you do is you have to put the interest of those under you ahead of yourself, but not necessarily ahead of the organization, right? We are leading with a purpose for an organization, right? And sometimes you have somebody that just is not a good fit, and unfortunately, occasionally you have to fire people as part of leadership. It goes with the territory. It sucks, but it goes with the territory, right? So are there good leaders and bad leaders? Yeah, it's just, to me, are you aligned with the purpose? And you asked for a definition. Let me back up to that. Right. Managers get the job done. Leaders get the job done better, and they inspire people to perform at their best.
Mm,
All right. So that's how I give a definition of leadership.
yeah, and a big difference between management and leadership. And I don't know, do you think that you can be a good manager and not be a good leader?
Oh, absolutely. You can be a good manager and be a good leader. You get the job done, you hit the numbers, and you have people all around you that are miserable. And that's not necessarily how it always goes, but that's what I'm looking at. And trust me, there were some times in the submarine force, just based on the circumstances, they were miserable.
Oh, I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
So as a leader, what do you do in those situations, moving from manager to leader?
Well, here's the example I always give. It's a very simple example. Okay. Once a week on every ship in the Navy, we have something called field day. It sounds like the fair, right? No, but it's horrible. It means everybody gets up and we are deep cleaning the ship, right? We are diving under the deck plates. We are getting in the dirtiest places possible to get rid of the dirt and keep the ship clean, right? And I realized one day that as engineer, if I had, let's say my electricians were all in one area of the ship and they were getting filthy and they were getting just horribly dirty, and they gave it everything they could for 3.5 hours. And then I walked to a different section of their area where they did not clean. It'd be easy for me to go just scream at them about how they didn't work and how nothing was getting done right. And you guys just completely ignored. So understand. So the answer is on the submarine, you have to find the right ways to encourage them at the right time. Now, if they truly messed up, I wasn't very encouraging, right? I mean, sometimes you could be encouraging you when they messed up, right? Saying, "Hey, I expect more of you." But on the submarine, there was so much to do. You could always find something, always find something wrong. You could always find a way to chew somebody's butt. And I chose the other way, that if they were working hard, I needed to find a way to encourage them in difficult situations.
Hmm. Well, and is that where your guiding principles came from? I know that you have some guiding principles that just from your experiences that you've had, one of those is purpose. So is that being on a submarine and leading on a submarine, is that where some of these guiding principles came from?
It did start. So the genesis of really when I put pen to paper, and I would encourage any of the listener, my idea here is I have my own leadership philosophy. I think everyone in a leadership position should develop their own leadership philosophy. It's basically your compass as
Mm,
to how to navigate difficult waters. All right. And so your original question, Wendy, was did I develop that? It was actually I had been out of the Navy for probably about 10 years and getting ready for a job interview that was a management position. I decided, hey, what do I believe? What do I think about leadership? And I just scribbled down a few notes, and that's where it started. So yes, it was based on what did I learn from the submarine force? What did I learn from the Naval Academy? But I didn't do it until 8 or 10 years after I'd left the submarine force.
mm. And what was that leadership philosophy that you wrote down?
So it started out with it's now 7 principles, and it hasn't changed in a long time, but it really just started with three items. It was find the right people, train them right, and pat them on the back often enough. Now there's more to it, but anybody in a leadership, or let's even go back, say management position, if you find the right people and you train them right and you encourage them enough, you've gone a long way on your
Mhm.
leadership journey to getting the job done. Especially, Wendy, you mentioned you do some talking with nonprofits, right? Nonprofits typically a lot of volunteer work, right? And those are organizations where you don't buy people with their back. In other words, they're not there for the paycheck, right? In the nonprofit space, you've got to find the right people, not just good people, right people, train them on what's going on, And you have to be, I mean, they're more than just about any place. You've got to be very encouraging to get them to stay on the journey.
Hmm. Yeah, I've always said if anybody really wants to test their leadership ability, just go ahead and lead a nonprofit because they don't have to be there. They're not compensated. They're usually volunteers. They all have different reasons that they have joined this nonprofit, and to bring all of those together and align towards a mission, it's not easy.
Oh, it's a big challenge.
Oh,
And
it'll
and
test your
and no matter
leadership.
what, no matter how good you are at that, I think part of, there's another example in that for the nonprofits, you're going to have some turnover, right?
Yeah,
Which I mean, no matter how good you are, people will come for a season and leave, which brings you back to the first element of that. You need to keep finding good people for your
that's
nonprofit
right. That,
as volunteers.
well, and Eric, how do you do that? How do you find what you call quote unquote the right people? And what does that look like? People who are aligned to the mission, people who are like, what does right look like and where do you find them?
Yeah, I love that question. I had to learn a little bit about it. So, how you do that correctly in the for-profit space, because you've got some HR guidelines, but generally speaking, okay, let me break it up in a couple things. I've talked about volunteer organizations. I've talked about the family. We're going to talk about the family too, as far as finding right people. But let me start with organizations. Okay, in the corporate world, you just keep talking to people, right? Let's say that I know historically, in my line of work, let's take retail, right, where there's a lot of turnover, right? If you don't have an opening right now, whoever the manager is should always be talking to people, right? Now, that doesn't mean you bring them in for a job interview if you don't have something open, but you give that person some encouragement. Hey, have you ever thought about doing this? Have you ever thought about, and find out if there's some interest? And I think that's a 10-to-1 discussion, meaning if you're looking for the right person, you've got to typically talk to and interview at least 10 people. So it's just a matter of talking, 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 talking. Wouldn't it be nice if you had 10 people working for you and you had two people turnover for good reasons, right? A retirement, you had somebody move because their spouse got an amazing job offer, so you just lost two of your 10, and you already had four people lined up that and start interviewing. Okay.
Mm.
Now let's talk about what that looks like. I mentioned in the family and volunteer organizations. You say, well, you don't get to pick your parents, you don't get to pick your brothers and sisters, but
I have two good sisters. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, two
yeah.
good, one not so good. But yeah, okay. Anyway,
Um, yeah, well, okay, they can
we
edit
get
that
to
out if
choose.
you don't want it. Um, you choose who you hang out with, right? And the
Yeah.
easiest example is parents, right? What is the audience you want your children to be around? We as individuals, right? We're still making choices to who we hang out with, and you eventually will become like those people. So you
Mm.
don't pick your family, but from your, most personal, intimate relationships, you do choose who you're around, and the same goes to volunteer organizations.
Yeah. Well, I find that fascinating that, you're on a submarine. You're not choosing your people.
I
So
get this
how,
question all the time.
yeah.
Uh,
So what does that look
you're
like?
right, we don't, but it still boils down to the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, right? So in finding the right people, I need to know, as chief engineer of a submarine, 55 officers and enlisted men, who are my 20%, right?
Mm. Hmm.
Who are the ones that I can count on to get the job done, right? And who can I give some other jobs to that may or may not be done and tell somebody else this needs supervision. So you're right, you don't get to pick them, all right? But so as an example there of who I picked, the command master chief's name was Eddie Barrett under the same Captain Larry Davis. And he was part of that crew that was just amazing. So the command master chief is the most senior enlisted person on any ship, right? On a submarine, we called him the Cobb, the chief of the boat, all right? But I'll still refer to him as the command master chief. He reported directly to the captain, right? Even though I was a senior officer to him, he didn't answer to me. But now the original question was, how do you find the right people? We got along great because we saw eye to eye on most everything. And when I saw a problem on the ship, I wouldn't first go to the captain. I would go to the command master chief because he had the pulse of everything. He was
Hmm.
down in the trenches.
Hmm.
And I would say, hey, I've got a problem with this person. And he would normally say, "Sir, give me 2 weeks and I'll fix it for you." My point being, I knew who to go to,
Yeah.
right? I found the right person. I knew who to go to that was the problem fixer. Now,
Hmm.
every now and then he'd say to me, "Yeah, I've had it with him too. I want you to go ahead and have your turn with him." Original question, how do you find the right people in when you say a submarine, let's just say a closed environment,
Hmm.
right? Maybe you're in a job where you don't get to pick those around you, but you have a leadership role. You need to find the people who you can count on.
Mm. Okay. Well, and once you've found those people, your next thing is to train those people. And that sounds so obvious. And so often, you think people know what they know and yet they're not performing. And I just have this philosophy that I don't think people wake up in the morning wanting to suck. So if they're not performing, there's probably something going on, right? So looking at myself first as a leader to go, wow, what did I miss in the training process? So how do you make your training better so that they are able to produce?
Um, what I did both in the submarine force and now what I do with qualified plans is I try to boil it down to basics and I would even say a stair step. In training someone, I always give this metaphor of building a house. Right? You've got to start with a foundation, and those are typically some very simple things, and they sound rote. They sound like you're just memorizing. They sound like they're unimportant. But when you don't have that foundation, well, the house falls apart, right? I mean, that's a simple metaphor, but it's the truth. I'm going to walk all the way through the house, and then I'll give you a sea story that's an example for that. But when you put up a frame and you put up walls, and everything is this step to build this training process that you're talking about, right? So one of the things I shared with young submarine officers was a foundational item that I learned from the captain who was there before Larry Davis. Okay. We didn't call him the best one ever, but he and I didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things. But it's interesting to me that I remember as foundational, the training issue that had to be shared to every junior officer was something that Captain Randy Preston, shared with me. Okay. And he had his priorities for when you were standing watch on a submarine. Priority number one, do not have a collision at sea. Now, yeah, you're smiling, you're laughing, but that's foundational.
Yeah.
Don't wreck the ship. And sometimes ships in the Navy would get in trouble because they lost focus on that. And we have had collisions of sea. Number two was don't run the ship aground. Don't hit the bottom, right? They were these foundational items that we can be the best war fighters in the world, but if you crash the ship, that's it. So some of the things I do now in training plans, committees are still, hey, let's start with the foundations. And you have
Mm.
to understand that, and then we will move on to the next step.
And don't assume that they have the foundation. Always start there.
Always, no matter how experienced they are, because you might find that there's a little bit of a difference in philosophy on the
Mm.
foundation.
I'm just trying to picture this whole, you're on a submarine and can you just paint the picture for us? What's it like to be on a submarine, not to mention the nuclear component? And do you have like an unforgettable moment that you could share with us to just paint the picture of what it was like to lead in a situation like that?
Um, I mean, I'd have to pick which unforgettable. It is. Yeah, here's the unforgettable moment I will give you is that so you mentioned the nuclear power part of it, right? Yeah, all U.S. submarines have a nuclear reactor, but there's a very,
Mm.
very strict, strenuous examination program that the Navy self-regulates itself, right? There's never been any kind of an accident that has blemished that record in the Navy, right? And so that exam every year, I think the best thing I could talk about is the last exam that I went through that this examining board comes on board, about half a dozen officers, and it's very, very stressful. I mean, it is the major exam for every submarine every year. And having gone through it 3 years in a row, spending weeks working up for it, the last exam I had, we were able to walk in and have a conversation with the examining board, and I felt there were a couple things that I taught them. Now, that's not because of me. That's
Mm.
because I had an awesome crew, engineering department of 55 people, and I trained them, and they participated, and they were on board, and they knew that my goal was that if our ship had to go to war in 6 months, we'd be ready. That was always my
Mm.
mission.
Yeah.
Not just we need to be good today, we need to be ready to go to war in 6 months, and that's the timeline we kept it at.
Wow. I can't even imagine, spending long missions in a confined high pressure environment. And I mean, for me personally, it would break me. I couldn't do it. And there's probably a lot of people that it would break. So, you talk about the right people. How do you build this mental toughness that would foster teamwork in those kinds of conditions?
Lenny, let's look at what you just said. You said that would break you. Okay. So not right for you. Here's the example I give all the time of finding the right people. And I'm sidestepping the question. We'll come back to it. Um, when I watched my mother dying in a hospice, I watched these hospice workers and thought, could never do this job.
Yeah.
They've got a special gift, right? And there are certain jobs in this world that people have a special gift for. And I will say this over and over and over. Parents of special needs children.
Mm.
God chose special parents
Mm-hmm.
to have those children. Okay.
100%.
So we've all got these unique skills. And so I found it very interesting, very humorous. This is after I got out of the Navy. I was at an event where they were training us how to clear your house from an intruder, okay, with a firearm, but it was run by a bunch of Navy SEALs, ex-Navy SEALs, right? And I struck up a conversation with this guy who's a Navy SEAL, right? I mean, the warriors of all warriors, and he found out that I was a submariner, and he got all. So he said, "Oh my gosh, I could have never done what you did," and I started laughing, right? But the
Yeah.
truth is, we all brought different skill sets to the table. So how do you do that time after time, day after day? When a lot of things were routine, right?
Mm-hmm.
You try to make sure they're not just routine, but and sometimes you'd get a sailor that just you find out a little too late that he wasn't active. And these days it's he and she, but in my day it was all men on submarines.
Mm-hmm.
That you'd have to send them somewhere else.
Yeah. And you'd have to make those tough decisions, I'm
Yeah,
sure. And was that the exception, or were there several people that you just found were not the right sailor?
it was by far an exception. It was rare, but
Okay.
it would happen now and then. Yeah.
Okay. So most you could bring along
Yes.
and support and walk beside them and whatever it took as a leader. So
Some with more
interesting.
struggles than others. Some with more
Yeah.
struggles than others.
Yeah. Well, and one of your other philosophies, so you find the right people, you train them, and you pat them on the back often. So dig into that a little bit, Eric. What does that look like as a leader, patting them on the back often?
So patting on the back often enough. Okay.
Mm,
So
good reframe.
often enough. So the reason and that was something I added. So what comes after patting him on the back often enough is you have to set a standard for excellence. All right. And whether that's, who your children are hanging out or what our excellence is in a volunteer organization, right? Um, I don't have to pat somebody on the back for not doing their job right. I don't have to pat somebody on the back for
Mm,
failing. Now, maybe I do pat somebody on the back for failing because they gave their best effort and circumstances, happened. It's possible. So that's why I use the word often enough to be encouraging to them, right? Going back to your last question, yeah, sometimes uh, oftentimes at sea on a submarine, it was just a crappy deal that I had to hand out to somebody, right?
mhm.
That the work hours and questioning whether they've even had enough sleep to be standing watch or doing maintenance, right? It was difficult to decide that. So pat them on the back often enough. Here's a number that I have found anecdotally. I find about half of people, just people in general, whether it's leadership or other, are encouragers and 50% are not. Okay,
Hmm.
it's not that they don't want to be an encourager. They just know that their natural personality is not to walk up to somebody and say, "Hey, great job. I'm proud of you. You're doing great around here." And the reason I've done that is once again, from a spiritual standpoint in leading high school boys in small group, I would just flat out ask them somewhere along the year, how many of you feel that you're an encourager? And almost every time, 50% of the hands would go up
Mm.
and 50% will not, right? So as a leader, I think those under you want to know that they're making a difference.
Mhm.
They want to know that they're doing a job that's important, right? Um, and so you do have to pat them on the back. This was a lesson I learned at the Naval Academy from the superintendent at the time, told this story, and it stuck with me. As chief engineer, I'd be walking through the engineering spaces, and it happened every now and then that one of my sailors would be doing a maintenance, routine maintenance where they're taking something apart, cleaning it, doesn't matter. And they would say, "Hey, engineer, let me show you something." What they wanted to show me was how smart they were. They weren't trying to show me this piece of equipment or how it worked. That's what they thought they were doing. But
Mm-hmm.
they really wanted to show me, hey, I'm important. You need me. I'm the guy that keeps this piece of equipment running. And anytime I possibly could, and I mean possibly could, I would stop and let them teach me about something. And I'd say good job, but patting them on the back was me stopping and spending some time with them.
Mm-hmm. Everybody wants to be seen. They want to be heard. They want to be known, and to stop and to tell them, good job, to tell them that they are, it's just recognize them. I think that has so much impact. So
It isn't.
Eric, when you raise that hand, you have people raise hands, are you an encourager? So the other 50% that's not, can they become encouragers?
They can. I don't think it comes naturally to them. And
Mm,
I would tell them, you need to work on that. That's not something
okay.
you can just say, hey, I'm not very good at this, so I'll just skip it. And from a leadership position, you absolutely have to figure out a way to do that.
Yeah, to just be intentional about it. And then eventually, if you're not that encourager, if you do it enough, does it then become easier, more innate?
I think it becomes a little bit easier. And I'm laughing from my perspective. I suffer from a little ADD, and it's a lifelong struggle to
Yeah.
stay focused on a task that needs to be done. Doesn't have to be done if it needs to be done in an hour, I'm focused, right? That's part of the territory with ADD. But if it's a prolonged project, I have to work to stay focused, and that's never become easier. So I think, and some human psychologists could tell me I'm wrong, and you will develop neural pathways. But those of you that are not encouragers naturally, yes, you're going to have to work at it your entire life.
Hmm.
But you need to do it if you want to be a good leader.
Yeah. Well, Eric, I so appreciate your wisdom and your experiences and your authenticity that you bring to the table with all of your leadership lessons. As someone with decades of just incredibly diverse leadership experiences, how do you define your leadership legacy, and what impact do you hope to leave?
So I guess this is the Stephen Covey question of what do I want people to say at my funeral? Maybe I'm being a little bit dramatic on that. I would, Wendy, I will go back um, to a faith perspective, right? And number one, when I'm not around anymore, I do want the first thing that people coming out of their mouth to say, "Hey, here's a man that loved Jesus and he showed it." Okay,
Mhm.
but I think the other part that goes along with that, right? And it's yes, it's a secular perspective, but I still go back to um, biblical principles. Colossians, I'm almost certain it's chapter 3 that says, "Work heartily as though working for the Lord and not for man." Right.
Mhm.
So, am I putting everything I can into when you say a legacy? Am I taking everything I learned in life, both from a Christian perspective and a professional perspective, and am I handing as much as I can and teaching others as much as I can while I'm still at it?
Mhm. Well, and you say, people, what would people say at your funeral? And I just have this passion that we share things like that now. I just think that's the most tragic thing, that, people don't know what their legacy was. And, it's funny, my son is 25 and he's out in the work field now, and, doing great things. And, he'll tell me stories, and he has just an amazing manager and just a phenomenal regional director. He's in sales, And every time he says something about them, I go, did you tell Amanda that? Did you tell Phoebe that? Because I just think, we need to be intentional about, I think part of that is patting each other on the back, not just as individual contributors, as leaders. So I see that you're making that legacy. So I appreciate that about you, Eric, for sure.
Well, thank you, Wendy.
Yeah. So out of all the things that you've learned, I always like to leave something for our listeners to say, what's something, if we have people who are wanting to lead, we have people who are new in a management role or leading, themselves, leading in their personal lives. What advice would you give them? Where do they start?
Yeah, that one's easy because I kept hoping you'd ask that question. I'm going to read quickly my leadership philosophy, and I'm not asking you, the listener, to develop my leadership philosophy, but to get out a notebook and whatever it is and develop, or something on the computer, develop your own leadership philosophy, right? And there's 7 elements to it. One is define and continuously refine your purpose. Number 2, find the right people. Number 3, train them right. 4, give them the tools they need to do their job. 5 is pat them on the back often enough. Number 6 is to set a standard for excellence. And number 7, while number 7 is a little nebulous, it's a bow around everything, is to be an inspiration. You need to be an encourager. So those 7 items, but more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, you, the listener, sit down and write, what is it you think would motivate people, your leadership philosophy, and then test it out. When you hear a speaker, right, who you respect as a leader, right? Oliver North once was the speaker at was a guest speaker at church. I broke out a pen and I started writing down everything Oliver North said, and I took it back and compared it to my leadership philosophy. And he took a different view on some things, but they were consistent. So my one recommendation is develop your own leadership philosophy on how you will lead people.
Starting with purpose. And I have this wall in my office that I've been working on my purpose statement. It's harder than you think.
It is. And the simple example there, though, and I go back to volunteer organizations, right, in the church, right? If your mission in life is to help single moms, then you don't necessarily have to be the one reaching out to widows, right? Not that, but that purpose keeps you focused on what you're doing. One of my favorite movies in life is about purpose, and it's the Book of Eli, right? And if you've never seen the Book of Eli, or maybe if you've never watched it that way, go look at a man with purpose. And there's one scene in that movie where there's a small family getting hurt by the road warriors and the criminals. And he says, stay on the path. This is not your purpose. As hard as it is for him not to go and help where it's needed, he says to himself, stay on the path. This is not your purpose.
So good. We couldn't have planned that ending, Eric. I'll be listening to that, or not listening, I'll be watching that movie on the airplane. Because wow, that's powerful. Well, Eric, so many great insights. Thank you so much for coming and spending your time on Unleashed. And if people want to contact you, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Just send me an email. It's edyson, EDYSON at 90 North LLC. That's the number 90. So it's 90northllc.com. So one more time, edyson at 90northllc.com, or just look for me on LinkedIn. And any questions for follow-up, I'd be happy to entertain or engage anyone if they have questions.
Excellent. Very good. And for our listeners, we'll make sure that all of Eric's information, including his email that he just gave, is in the show notes. And we also will put a link to his LinkedIn profile so you can connect with him there. So, Eric, I just want to thank you again. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to Unleash with Wendy Swanson. Make sure to subscribe and follow to be notified when the newest episodes of the podcast go live. Please take a moment to rate and review us. It helps others discover Unleashed and join our movement of forward-thinking leaders. You can find contact information and important links in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode, and remember, keep leading with authenticity, embrace change, and choose to live life unleashed.